You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm good. And yourself?
I'm good. I'm excited about today's episode. We've been talking about Zero Trust so much in past episodes, and our guest, I'll wait for you to do the introduction, but he was the first person to explain it to me in a way that I understood. Now, fortunately, what I can say for myself was that was many years ago, but still, like, I've been hearing about Zero Trust for, it feels like over a decade now, and this person can really distill it for us. So without further ado, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and introduce Dr. Chase Cunningham. He's the Chief Strategy Officer at Ericom Software. He's also the author of the book, Cyber Warfare, True Tactics and Strategies. Welcome to the show, Chase.
Hey, thank you all for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Jim's right. Zero Trust has definitely been top of mind. I think it's only just kind of grown in mind share, especially over the last, basically year or two, especially with a pandemic and people trying to figure out how to get people access to resources in a safe and secure manner. And, maybe they planned on this type of approach and maybe they didn't, and they're being forced into it. So I'm looking forward to having this type of conversation with you to, help educate our listeners and ourselves around, some of the capabilities and things that go along with Zero Trust. But before we get into that, anytime we have a guest on the show, we always like to find a little bit more about their identity and access management background. So I'm curious, how did you get into the identity space? Is it something that chose you, or did you choose it?
Well, I would say it's, I like most other things in my life, I've been blessed to kind of stumble into spaces that seem to be beneficial. And identity has always been something that's been core to my perspective on cybersecurity. I came out of the military and the government and did a lot of red team type things there, and then did a bunch of that on the consulting side after. And for me, I always was, kind of wrapped around the perspective of, I'm not going after firewalls, and I'm going after users and accesses and passwords and hashes and those types of things. So that's where I would say I really became specific to thinking about how critical identity is to the whole cybersecurity sort of paradigm.
Hey, Chase, before we jump into the whole piece about Zero Trust, tell us a little bit more about this book.
Yeah, so I was lucky that Packet asked me to write. They basically said, what kind of topic would you want to write? And I was like, well, I would like to write a book about strategy in cyberspace and about what I consider to be the sort of historical proof that this is a battlefield environment, not that it is a place for sending kitty pictures and grandma. I mean, obviously it happens and is necessary, but it's really a combat field. And the only way you survive combat is to have a strategy where you outlast the adversary. And that was what I took the approach in the book of. I think all the feedback I've gotten has been very positive. It's been nominated for the Cybersecurity Canon Hall of Fame. And it's the focus of it was really about, if you do these things, this is what you should expect. And this is the reality of the space in which you operate.
So how do you get started writing a book? Because I think this is something that's always interested me, is what is how do you sit down and buckle down and put, pen to paper or finger to keyboard to get something started?
I think for me, it was really one of those deals where they reached out to me and said, look, we'd like somebody to write a book about cyber warfare. And then they kind of just said, go at it however you'd like. But I mean, that's the fourth book that I've been sort of published or co-published. I'm working on another one now. And it's one of those deals where I've always found that you just kind of start. It doesn't really matter if you think you've got, Hemingway in your blood or whatever. You just kind of, word vomit and work your way forward from there. Because eventually you can keep polishing that thing until it becomes a good piece of literature. And that's where you're trying to get to. I would say, to be totally honest, I've never started a writing project with an end state in mind. I just start writing.
Chase, I haven't read the book yet, but I just threw it in my my purchase, my shopping cart on Amazon. So I am going to get it. One of the things about security and identity and access management that I always found was that if you're in an industry, right, your companies are competing with other companies. However, as security practitioners, we are kind of in the same boat together and been willing to kind of share, not inside secrets per se, but at least approaches, frameworks, and information that we're kind of all in this together. So I'm wondering, how does that strike you, that statement that I just made there? But then also, were you interacting a lot with other folks in the industry to get information to kind of cite them as you're going, or was this really you sitting down and just going from your brain?
No, I reached out to a whole lot of different folks. I actually was very fortunate that I had the first CIO for the federal government, retired General Gregory Toohill, wrote my forward, and he gave me some insight too. I talked with a whole bunch of other folks, including the founding father of ZT, John Kindervag, and others, as far as getting that in. And I always want to make sure that I'm working on something. I never do it in a vacuum. There's a billion people way smarter than me, so I love to pick other folks' brains, and that was kind of where you can start seeing trends. And it's interesting to me when you say that we're all connected and everything else, because we are. We're even more connected nowadays. But when you get into looking at the trends and data and kind of the indications of where this space gravitates, you honestly have to try and ignore how vital identity is to this whole thing. I mean, it is key and core to the entirety of cybersecurity.
Hey, let's shift a little bit towards zero trust, because as I mentioned before, you were the first person to explain it to me in a way that I really started to get it and understand. Now, at the time, you were with Forrester, right? And you kind of, one of the things you did was you gave a little bit of a historical background of zero trust. So maybe we start there. Kind of what is the historical background? Who's the brainchild of it? And then how did it evolve from that point?
Yeah. So if you go back to the very earliest references to ZT, it's actually 2004 with a group of CISOs and academics in the APAC region that were called the Jericho Forum. And what they basically were doing was thinking about, well, what did security look like when you looked at the fundamental requirements of an infrastructure? And then would that work when people weren't inside of an office? And at that time, they weren't necessarily thinking about big cloud and the sort of post-pandemic side of things, but they were thinking about, if there is going to be more remote work, people are going to be outside of the corporate office, everybody's moving to laptops. And that was kind of where it began. And then if you go forward from that a little bit more, John Kindervag, who was an analyst at Forrester prior to me being there, he saw what they were talking about. He thought it made a lot of sense. He could see the trends going in the space. And he basically said, well, what are the fundamental things we're dealing with at large within infrastructure? And it's trust relationships. And in order to be more secure, we should strive to get towards zero of established trust relationships. Therefore, let's call it zero trust. Earlier on, it was called deperimeterized security, and that's just not good marketing, to be perfectly frank. Zero trust is much more succinct. And then from there, it kind of was like firewall, NAC, data identification, et cetera. And as we've evolved over time, now it has become an all-encompassing strategy that is gravitates around what users do, how they access things, excessive privileges, all those other sides of it.
Well, you are on the Identity at the Center podcast, and I kind of feel like identity really is at the core of a good zero trust approach. And wondering if you agree with that, and kind of how do you see identity fitting into taking that zero trust approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is I think I published this a while ago, like identity is the mechanism around which the gears of zero trust revolve. And Sean, Ryan, and I, and other analysts at Forrester published a paper on identities beyond human, which is also interesting because if you think about it, machines have identities now, robots have identities, cars have identities. I mean, if it has a unique identifier and it does something digitally, it has an identity, and all of those things are potential avenues of compromise. It's not necessarily the human issue, but it is an identity. And you hear people say all the time too, like, well, the most secure system in the world is the one no person's ever touched. Correct. But the reason that is because no identity, no access, no user of any type has ever been on that system. So if that's the reality, then that must mean that identity is the central point of this thing.
Obviously, we named the podcast for a reason, so it works out pretty well from that perspective, right? With all this talk around zero trust, I think something that gets lost sometimes is who is zero trust right for? Is there a certain type of organization? Is it based on size? Is it based on resource? Is it based on vertical, or is it really something that kind of spreads across pretty much everywhere?
Well, it's one of these things where it's about security strategy, and I do workshops with folks all over the world, really talking about how this can be applied to them. And it's okay if you're one of those organizations that doesn't like the term zero trust because you think it might hurt your relationship with employees or whatever. Fine, but the basics of it are what you're trying to focus on is what you should consider like the physics of what's required to cause compromise, which is inherent trust relationships, default configurations, all those things that we talk about, and removing those just by the practices that you're putting in place. You can call that strategy whatever you want. However, the industry has accepted ZT as kind of the common point of conversation. And this is not something that is inherent only to mega enterprises. Like, this works for mom and pop shops. I have a zero trust sort of environment here at my house. Like, this is something that can be applied to anybody everywhere. And that is the real beauty of an actual strategy, is that it's something that can be translated between organizations or even between users.
All right. So now you've got me interested. You mentioned zero trust in your house. You've got to explain what you mean by that.
Well, so like, I've got my firewalls and everything else, and I've got a Wi-Fi mesh networking for my kids and everybody else. But me, in my office, I run on my own separate LAN. I connect direct to where I need to go. Everything has got MFA on it. Like, I've got my own little corporate setup. For my kids, they're all running on Chromebooks. They all run through their own segment of the network. They can only go out to where they need to go, and they have MFA applied to everything they need. And it is where I am in control of the router, firewall, switching infrastructure. So when I see stuff, and I get a report every day on everything going on in my network, if there's an anomaly, I'm investigating it. And it's one of these deals where, like, it took me maybe 2 days to get it configured the way I wanted, but it's up and running, and I can look, like, literally right now and see that one of my kids upstairs has got too many scans running on their machine. So later on today, I'm going to have to figure out what's going on with that thing.
I kind of I think about when I got into IT many moons ago, and kind of the approach of the corporate network was, there's a firewall. Outside of the firewall are outsiders. Inside the firewall are the insiders, or AKA the people we trust. And I think what zero trust is about is that just because you're inside the firewall doesn't mean that you can be trusted. Not that you're not a trustworthy person, right? But just that, number one, people can get past firewalls, right? There are many entry points into a network. And number two, I mean, when you look at data breaches that are occurring, it's something like a third of them are insiders that are performing data breaches. So the firewall, here's another point that I want to make, is that I don't think that the firewall is not something useful. I mean, heck, you just gave the breakdown of your.
Well, you got to have firewalls, yeah.
Yeah. The firewall's not going away. It's just that just because somebody's inside of the firewall, or just because an identity is inside the firewall, doesn't mean that its activities can be trusted. So that's kind of the way I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's also, I like to think about it too, as far as if you think about zero trust at the broad strategic level, right? It's kind of like if I think about what goes on with driving my vehicle somewhere, and this is a little bit crazy for people to think about, but when I get in my car, I don't have to do things to make myself safer. It's about as safe as it's going to get, because I have airbags that are automatic. I have a GPS, which is built into the system. I know where I'm going. I've got a seatbelt. The engine has got governors on it that will only allow me to go so fast. And then when I get on my network, quote, the street, that is owned by the state. And the state and the federal government kind of have made it where I can get where I'm going and pipe me directly to what I need to do. And then I do what I got to do when I come home. And I mean, that's kind of what you're talking about when you think about what it should look like as far as firewall network infrastructure and moving a user from somewhere to somewhere else. You don't, hopefully just kind of jump in your car, don't do any security, anything, no safety, whatever, and just, bag it down the road and hope you're going to get where you're going safely. It's really about leveraging the resources that are in front of you and having security and safety built into the apparatus that you're using.
About a year and a half or 2 years ago, I started seeing a lot of IAM and security products saying, in other words, we're zero trust certified. Not really, but
Yeah, because there's no certification yet. Yeah.
yeah, they're packaging their marketing around zero trust, which is cool because it started to create that kind of mind share where a lot of the clients that Jeff and I work with are saying, our target is zero trust. We're working towards the zero trust framework. And you mentioned you're consulting with organizations and telling them how to get towards zero trust. And I know you've got to run into clients at all ends of the spectrum in terms of how mature they are, how ready they are. But kind of talk to us a little bit about how you approach that and how an organization might get started down the zero trust route.
Well, it really boils down to there is a maturity curve here, and maturity curve is kind of based off of where you space around compliance. And while I'm not necessarily a fan of compliance being your end state, it is a good line in the sand for kind of where you are. So if you're an organization that's been heavily compliant, healthcare, banking, whatever, you probably have solved a lot of some of the more intricate problems in cyber, at least hopefully you have. So you're probably further along the road towards a more zero trustee type infrastructure. Whereas if you're new to cyber, you're a small business, you're outside of those heavily compliant sort of frameworks, you're probably solving for what you would consider to be the earlier problems in ZT, and that's okay. The thing about this is solve for what you need to solve for. It's not everything all the time, and continue to invest in the things that solve those problems strategically as you progress going forward.
So it's really kind of an order of operations then to getting zero trust in place. You kind of have to have the basic blocking and tackling in place to be able to get to zero trust, or do you see it as being able to kind of start at either spectrum, whether they're immature or not?
I mean, I think really, if you look at where the market has been trending, the smart play is to try and move more to the cloud faster, because that is your greenfield environment, and you can do so much more. Like Google just published their Beyond Corp stuff, which you could build a zero trust infrastructure in Google, be good to go. Microsoft has got their zero trust thing for Azure. It's starting to show up in more places. So I think in reality, the better place to be, if you do it correctly, let me make sure I caveat that, is the cloud. However, you can still enable ZT in legacy infrastructure, but it's probably a bit of a heavier lift.
Yeah, there's probably more legacy decisions that we made that kind of need to be unwound and unspun right within an organization. Is there a particular type of organization or company that you see has been doing zero trusts, pretty well? And I'm not talking about things like Google and Microsoft, where they obviously have, their own type of implementation kind of approaches to that we can talk about in a minute. But I'm just curious from like a real world example, do you have any that you can talk about?
Well, I mean, I think a really great example as far as the long focus on this is we've been doing a bunch of work with the federal government, specifically U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force, on their migration to ZT. And for them, I mean, this is a giant infrastructure, right? 400,000 node network. They say, look, our plan is to be a manageable zero trust infrastructure by 2030. So, I mean, they're talking 10 years, 9 years of evolution, and they're very, very pragmatic about it. They know that they're, the leadership there has basically said, we're going to start from scratch as we move into this gov cloud infrastructure, which is super. And then there's been some banks that I've worked with that have said, interesting point for them was they're like, look, we want to move to ZT. And they said, well, we're going to start with like 5,000, users. And my response to them during those workshops was, let's start with 50, right? 5,000 is huge. That's boiling the ocean. Like, let's make sure we have everything right: entitlements, accesses, privileges, logins, MFA, for 50 users. And when we have that, then we can do 100, and then we'll just continue to replicate that going forward. And for them, to their credit, they said, look, this is going to take us, I think a double what they had estimated in time, but they've been getting it right.
Yeah, I would imagine that, it's a lot of it is predicated on the concept of, roles which are applied to the rules within the zero trust framework. So
role-based access.
Yeah, if you got a 400,000 node network in the case of the government, that's going to take some time, right? To slot people into the right roles.
Networks were built in the 60s, so.
Yeah, there's probably like, is there a zero trust for punch cards? That
It's
might be
funny you mentioned that because I did do a workshop with a government organization that still has punch cards, and for that it was like, I think you just segment that off.
So let's talk a little bit more detail around Beyond Corp, which is Google's version of Zero Trust. They recently, I want to say it was just a couple days ago, and we're recording this on January 28th for those who are interested in the fourth wall, is that has now become generally available.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good starting step for folks, at least who are on the Google Cloud platform. But I believe it still works across other clouds and maybe even on-premise applications as well. And one of the things that is important to their implementation of this, and really to all of them, is this concept of an identity-aware proxy that sits in front of applications that basically translates the rules or the roles that are assigned and then matches that up with the resources. Is that the correct way to think about it, at least in the Beyond Corp version of it?
Yeah, and what's a really good point to take away there is Google started on together for infrastructure a few years ago after the Operation Aurora thing, and you notice that you haven't heard Google in the news in the last couple of years as far as compromise or breach activity, and they've deployed Beyond Corp for them their zero trust implementation globally, and it's been a real game changer. So when you see a corporate entity that's that big, that's that diverse, that's that fast do these types of things and it works for them, it's a good thing of like, I think we can aspire to that too. And it Beyond Corp as a service is actually pretty slick. Like I haven't got my hands in it yet to play with it, but I've seen the demo. I've had briefings from Google. It's a pretty cool system. I'm personally a big fan of the GCP infrastructure because you can do lots of things. And they're making it where you don't have to be a zero trust, PhD to do zero trust things.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits too from the Google side is they have YouTube. So they have, scale, and they have, the latency issues kind of figured out because they're running it internal, at least for their Gmail and their YouTube infrastructure. And, I will include a video that I found that kind of explains how you get started with Beyond Corp and kind of what are the different components around it. So that hopefully, that'll help people as well. Are there any differences between what Microsoft is pitching as zero trust versus Google's version of it?
Well, I think Microsoft's one thing that they've done differently besides the Titan key as part of their authentication protocol is Microsoft has kind of set up, I guess you'd call it a work center for organizations and businesses to talk with them. And they actually have people there that are dedicated to help you figure out how to use Azure, set stuff up with Azure, leverage the resources there correctly. So it's one of those deals where it's kind of cool. Well, it's not kind of cool. It is cool because it's actually a way of guiding people through the process of using Azure to do it. And it's while Google's good because it gives you the capability and that breadth of offering across that infrastructure, they kind of just drop it in your lap and say, here's how it works. Whereas what I like about Microsoft is it's big and it's complex, but they do have dedicated resources where you can go and say, hey, I don't know how to do this. And someone will, an actual human will get there and go, look, let me walk you through that process.
Hey, Chase, I thought it was really interesting how when Jeff asked about organizations that are kind of leading the charge, and you mentioned some of the military and banks, and kind of think to myself, okay, yeah, the benefit for them, the risk profile, it's kind of obvious. But what I've been seeing is that attacks are heading kind of downstream towards smaller, mid-sized businesses. And, I think for those organizations, a lot of times the security and identity practitioners are kind of having to convince their upper management that, hey, we need to be secure. Maybe not as secure as a bank, but we're at risk as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and kind of changing mindsets and what you're seeing in terms of small and mid-sized businesses, needing an approach like zero trust.
Yeah, and that's so funny thing you would say that because chapter 3, page 55 of my book, literally the title of that is attacks move downstream. And I think what we're seeing is that the adversaries have kind of realized that, look, the government, big banks, big healthcare, they kind of have figured out the way to make themselves a harder target. And obviously they can still be got because anybody can, but they're at least typically is a more difficult target. So what does that mean for the adversaries, especially the adversaries that are not government related, hardcore AT, persistent threat type operators? Well, that means you go after the slow gazelles, and the slow gazelles on the cyber Serengeti are, small and mid-sized businesses, and you go after them with things like phishing and drive-by downloads and ransomware and those type of attacks. And the goal there is to get in and then weasel your way up into those bigger infrastructures because of shared privileges, excess access, bad passwords, all the things that we know will eat your lunch. And it, from the adversary perspective, like, why would I waste my time trying to bang down the door of the FBI when I could work my way through, a business that has access to something that does bigger work within the federal government or a big bank? And I mean, that's what we saw with SolarWinds, which SolarWinds isn't a small company, but what did they do to get in there? They worked through the software supply chain to get in, and then they worked their way into infrastructure. It's a great example of moving downstream to go upstream.
So for our Talladega Nights fans, if the whole saying, if you're not first, you're last. In this case, if you're not last, you're first, right? It's about not being, the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest target for people. As long as you're faster than, the other person that the bear is chasing after, you've got a pretty good shot of getting away. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and it's also one of those things where people need to remember, like I said, that this is a warfare environment, and there are no allies. There is no Geneva Convention in cyber. Like, there is no rule or law that says that you can't be gotten by somebody. I mean, it is literally whoever isn't the harder target is going to go down sooner or later, and it's not a matter of being afraid. It's just that's the reality of what it is. So you're transiting an environment that is the only place in history where every human, every access, every business, every government is all at play in the world of trying to get one up on each other. And that's where the slow gazelle gets eaten by the faster lion.
Yeah, and I guess it's also probably important to note too, right? If someone is specifically targeted, right, then
you're gonna get got. I mean, that's it. You're gonna get got.
So let's talk a little bit about what Ericom does, because I find it very interesting around the remote browser isolation concept that you've worked into Zero Trust. Can you talk a little bit about it at a high level? What is it and how does that fit into that Zero Trust framework?
Sure. So the first piece of that really, and we have a new offering that's going to be launched, I think in March, which is specific to small and mid-sized enterprises. That's all ZT related. But the RBI thing really, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago at Forrester. I was interested in it as far as I thought it made sense in the context of ZT. Is basically, what does everybody use to access the internet? Well, they use a browser. Well, okay, then where would you get from most likely? Via the browser. So it does make sense based on the historical context of endpoints not doing well and antivirus kind of failing when adversaries go after you, to try and run protection when the software is actually on your machine. Or can I use the cloud, put an emulator up there, and the user doesn't know that they're actually operating in a cloud-based virtual browser, and then all the bad stuff happens there and I'm removed from it. So it's, in the context of ZT, it's one of those deals where I don't trust that my users might not interact with malicious content, so I'm going to push them through remote browsing, and that way I can protect them in that remote instance. And I use our RBI all day, every day. I don't notice weird blippy stuff. The only time that you might see a little bit of a blip is if you're doing like heavy duty gaming through the browser, which most people typically don't do. But regular old stuff, YouTube and everything else, I have never noticed an issue with me being able to access stuff and see it just like it is on the regular old Chrome browser.
Yeah, that's very cool because, for those not familiar with the acronym RBI, Remote Browser Isolation, and I'm glad you mentioned the gaming thing because I am a bit of a gamer and I have actually used quite a few of the gaming services, and that's or the cloud gaming service, I should say, things like Google Stadia, Shadow PC, GeForce Now. And that is one of the biggest problems that most people have with that type of concept is you're essentially streaming, all this data and video. Sometimes it's in 1080p HD, and sometimes, you're trying to get it up to 4K. That's a lot of bandwidth. And, you mentioned that you haven't experienced any, major blips in that. I think that is really interesting because that's also one of the things that when I think about from a privilege access management perspective and session recording and monitoring and things like that, where you're setting up these sessions, that's been a historical kind of pain point that administrators face as well. The performance just isn't as good as if it was native, but
Right.
it sounds like you're able to kind of work around that, and that it works this across browsers too, right? Does this require a certain browser like Chrome or?
Nope, you use whatever browser you want. It doesn't matter. It's just it's once it's up and running, it's a proxy configuration. Takes 30 seconds, and then you're done. If that long, if if you've configured a proxy, it's less. But once you're up and running through there, you really don't know it. And I mean, I never want to tell people that something is perfect. I mean, every once in a while you run into some old outdated weird site or something like that, and you might see a little bit of rendering issue. But in general, for the average everyday stuff that you use the browser for, I've never run into an issue. And we actually have a capability in there called crystal rendering that basically eliminates a lot of that sort of kludginess that you would get with some of the other RBI solutions. So you don't notice that it's there. And that, I think, is where you get a lot of value in security, is the user's just doing what they do. They're not having to configure anything, change it. I'm not saying turn a VPN on or whatever. Just use this plugin, go browse the internet, like problem solved.
Is there a certain bandwidth requirement to be able to achieve that kind of experience?
We've got POPs and everything all set up all over the world so that we have, the connectivity that's needed there. Other than every once in a while, you might run into, if everybody in the house is, my kids are on the net and I'm on the net, we have gig speed. And every once in a while, I've gone on to something and I've seen a little bit of a blip in it, but nothing where it's been, degrading my user experience.
That is really cool. And I'll put a link to Ericom in the show notes too, so people can check that out. Definitely recommend taking a look at it. Chase, I know you've been really generous with your time with us, and I want to start getting things closed out here for us on this episode. But before we go, are there any final kind of words of wisdom from the doctor that you can give out to everyone?
Well, I mean, I really think the most important thing in this space, honestly, and this is from a guy that now works for a vendor, right, is don't focus on the technology. Focus on the strategy that you're putting in place first, and then find technology that enables that strategy. It's literally the difference between survival and being the slow gazelle. And if you really look at what you need versus what you think you need, there's a lot of value there. So just take your time, be very I wouldn't say academic, but very formulaic as to what problems you're trying to solve. And once you know that, and you've got a good grounding into what you're trying to do and why it's of value to you, then go look for technology that helps you do that. And if you do those things and you continue to progress going forward in that manner, you get to a better place. And when you do, get to a better place, user experience gets better, everybody gets happier, you become more secure, all those good things occur.
That's great advice. I think that's something that's worth repeating, is making sure that you understand what are your actual requirements and making sure that those align with whatever that strategy is. You don't want to get blinded by the shiny bell or whistle that really is it's a 1% thing when you can solve 80% of your issues in another area. So that's great advice. Jim, is there anything that you'd like to close out with?
I'm sitting here listening to Chase, and I was thinking, all right, I had a great idea, which is that I want to put together a blog article of the top 10 people to follow on LinkedIn, and Chase is up there, Brian Krebs, or a few others. So I'm going to put that list together, and Jackson Shaw is another one who we've actually had on the podcast. People who put a lot of great content out on LinkedIn. Chase, I know that you're very open to networking, so I'm sure a lot of if you're listening to this podcast, Chase Cunningham is somebody you should be connected to on LinkedIn. But I have kind of a follow-up question, so tangential to that, because I get a lot of great articles and webcasts and things that you publicize on LinkedIn, but I'm wondering, what are you reading right now? What are the, maybe one or two things for the practitioners who are listening to this podcast that maybe they could tune into to kind of enhance their knowledge?
I think there's a really good book that was published recently by the CISO at SMU, Southern Methodist University. His name's George Finney. He wrote a really great book called Well Aware. He has a podcast called Well Aware as well. I think everybody should check that out, because he did a good job of boiling down the hard stuff into the basics of like habits and practices to make you better in cybersecurity. So I would say that that's definitely one. And then if you also would look at anyone that has been, deeply entrenched in sort of the mantra around security strategy, I say read their stuff all the time. There's great articles from Josh Salonis, from Jeff Pollard, Joseph Blankenship, John Kindervag, all around how this whole thing is applied and built and put together. And those folks put out quality content that's not hardcore vendor biased, and I personally can't read enough of what they publish.
And I'll be sure to put links to that stuff in our show notes so people can check it out. So we'll have a whole bunch of stuff that people can check out, as far as reading material, Zero Trust, connecting with Chase, his book. Let me make sure I get the title again here correctly. Cyber Warfare, True Tactics and Strategies, which you can find on Amazon. So Chase, definitely appreciate your time and hope to have you back on the show at some point here. With that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.